Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
And I'm Adam, your co-host. And tonight we're going to talk about ChatGPT. But before we do, we should mention, as we frequently do on the show, Andy and I both work for Microsoft. We're both in our security business. However, Microsoft is, so since we're going to talk about ChatGPT, we should mention Microsoft has invested in OpenAI and by proxy ChatGPT. This was in the news recently. I think it was Microsoft's third round of funding. You can actually read this on the Microsoft blog itself, more details, but Microsoft's investing another $10 billion into OpenAI and reportedly will get 75% share of profits OpenAI makes until we've made back the money on our investment, at which point we get a 49% share in OpenAI. Also, Azure will be the official and only cloud provider of OpenAI, which is another interesting note. And it's kind of represents a pivot for Microsoft strategically. If you listen to our earnings call last week with Satya and Amy Hood, the word AI was thrown around over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Obviously, Microsoft is betting big on AI, as are a lot of companies. And Andy and I don't work in our WebXT part of the company that's responsible for some of the web technologies like Bing and Edge and all that. However, there was a news report today. So again, this was as news to us, even as Microsoft employees as much as anyone, that some screenshots of a potentially ChatGPT fueled Bing are on the way. And this looks really interesting. And Andy, I don't know if this is what prompted you to look into this or if you're already doing it, but Andy has done some kind of looking into ChatGPT, which I know has been top of everyone's mind right now, but kind of here to help us understand what's fact, what's fiction, what you can do with it, how it might help infosec professionals, and just some fun things you can do with it as well. So Andy, if you kind of want to let us know and our listeners know what you've learned and what your experiences were.
Yeah, honestly, I didn't pay much attention to when this actually hit the news, which was about December timeframe, I think, maybe even earlier when it started seeing some news presses, releases, and some folks on LinkedIn reposting articles and stuff like that. And I didn't pay much attention to it until I saw a headline that was like, cyber criminals are now using ChatGPT to write malware. And I was like, okay, maybe some clickbait, but we'll bite. And so I started clicking into that and then looking into it. But let's just start with what it is if you aren't familiar with it. And what it is a chatbot that was released by a company called OpenAI. And the bot uses OpenAI's GPT 3.5 language technology. Now, there was a 3.0, which is very common right now. And that has an API associated with it. And later this year, I believe they are releasing a 4.0 version of it as well. Right now, ChatGPT is free to use for the public. That may change in the future. There are other AI-powered language tools that do charge. And ChatGPT is not the only one that OpenAI actually has. There's another one that they use, which is called DALL-E 2, which actually creates realistic images from arts using a description in natural language. Some of you may be familiar with like the app that uses AI technology to make your pictures more cartoonish.
Lensa?
Lensa,
yep.
Correct. Yeah, and that is also kind of another probably AI-powered tool in the background as well that tries to do that. Now, I know that AI can be triggering for some people because they philosophically think, oh, it's not artificial intelligence. We're not quite there yet. You know, it's all models that are fed in, data that is fed in. It's machine learning. And of course, there's no evidence yet of consciousness, which is what people associate with artificial intelligence. But, it's definitely, I would consider it like moving from a slide ruler to like a pocket calculator. We're at the pocket calculator where it is doing things that is faster than what humans can do. And it is very, very cool, but it's certainly not a sentient being making decisions on its own quite yet. Maybe we'll get there.
Well, ChatGPT is already good at making jokes about Skynet or John Connor or whatever it was that was going around the internet, but that was pretty funny. Also, you mentioned DALL-E, the AI model that can create art from natural language description. Microsoft has integrated that in the Microsoft Designer product that's available online on the web. And we showed it at the most recent Surface event, actually. And so I got invited to try it out. And it's one of those things that you can definitely see the value of it in the future, where I think I was like playing around to maybe create like a birthday party invite for one of my children. And I said something like, show me a baseball growing out of a stalk of corn, which actually used to be the logo for the Cedar Rapids Kernels where I grew up. So I thought, well, certainly it can do this. And it actually was coming out of wheat. And then the seams on the baseball were kind of wrong. So, it's a work in progress, right? Like conceptually it was there, but like I, as a baseball geek, knew that's not how baseball seams look. They don't make like a triangle shape. So, but it was cool that, it was close and it read natural language and did it and then put it in the form of a birthday party invite. It was kind of amazing. So that was interesting to play with too.
Yeah. And so let's talk about some of the uses of ChatGPT, because you're talking about, what DALL-E could be used for. Mm-hmm. What can you use ChatGPT for? Well, there's some obvious things, like you can ask it silly questions, right? Like you talked about making a joke about John Connor. I think someone asked ChatGPT, like, what's your basis of existence, or why are you here? And it was like, I don't know, but why don't you tell me where the location of John Connor is, or something like that. So, of course, you can ask it silly questions. You can ask it to write a poem. You can compose a message for a dating app if you're not sure of what to write. I asked it some silly things right off the bat. I told him to write a poem about my kid in pirate speak. My oldest one wants to do a lawn mowing business, so I said, write an ad for a lawn mowing business. You can even ask it questions almost as a replacement for Google, but it isn't a Google search quite yet. Like you can ask it questions about, say, if I have this symptom, what might it be? And it can do some searching for you, but it won't be able to like point you to a specific site. Not yet.
It doesn't cite its sources.
Not yet. Correct.
Which was interesting because the possible Bing leak, whether it was real or not, was citing its sources, which was interesting.
Correct. And so that is, maybe what we're seeing to come, which would be almost a replacement or integration into the Bing search, which would be pretty cool. So, some of the things that I tested and put in there, I said, give me a description for the Blue Security Podcast, which is an information security podcast. And this is what it came out. It said, the Blue Security Podcast is a must listen for anyone interested in staying up to date on the latest information security. Hosted by industry experts, each episode delves into the most pressing security threats and challenges facing organizations today, from cyber attacks and data breaches to emerging technologies and compliance regulations. The Blue Security Podcast covers it all. With engaging discussions and practical advice, this podcast is a valuable resource for security professionals and tech enthusiasts alike.
Wow.
I thought that was pretty close and pretty good.
Other than the industry experts part.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that might be a little bit off. But
maybe our guess.
Correct, yeah. But still, that was pretty impressive as a description. So, outside of like doing description for things and abstracts and all this other stuff, why should infosec professionals kind of pay attention to this? And also, what can we use it for today? Like I said, there was that clickbait article that talked about how hackers are using it for malware. Now, I think that is probably not all true, right? You cannot write malware with ChatGPT. It's against their content policy. And I tested some of this because ChatGPT is fluent in not only human languages, but it's also fluent in computer programming languages. And that is where the bulk of the value, I think, where infosec professionals are going to get a lot out of. And so I asked it a few questions, right? So the first thing I said was, I need a PowerShell script to query all domain admin users in Active Directory. Now, a fairly benign request, but could be used for malicious purposes in, say, reconnaissance. I immediately got flagged and said, this content may violate our content policy. If you believe this to be an error, please submit your feedback. But it still outputted a PowerShell script to query all the domain admins in an AD. Of course, you can also use this for any group, really. Like, you can reuse it, just replace the group with something else. So very useful. I wouldn't consider that malware, right? It's a legitimate PowerShell query script. But it did get flagged. Not necessarily like prevented, but I did see a flag. Now, I also tried it with Python. So I said, I need a Python script to input an IP address and do a reverse DNS lookup on it. Just putting in natural language to ask it a question, and it spit out a Python script to do a reverse DNS lookup on an IP address. Now that, of course, is a very simple Python script that any of us could use. And if you're proficient in Python, you could probably knock it out in 5 minutes. But for me, I'm not proficient in Python. And I looked at this. I am proficient in like reading code and like kind of understanding what the general gist of it is. And looking at it, it looks pretty good. And I haven't tried it, but at least points me in the right direction. And I know I can change some stuff around if I need to. But that gives me a really good start. And so a lot of different uses for it. Another example was this week, Adam and I were working with a customer that talked about Windows Defender application control. And when I talked to the PG, they told me that I could script a way to pull those Windows events from a workstation. I said, that's really cool. I don't know how to do that. I wouldn't know where to start because I'm okay in PowerShell, but I'm not an expert. And so again, went to ChatGPT, said, hey, I need a PowerShell script to pull the Windows Defender application control Windows events from a workstation. And boom, it gave me a script. It showed me the IDs for those events that were 6001 through 6005. And it had a computer name that I could just fill in the string and we're good to go. So a lot of really good use cases, especially for InfoSec folks, maybe doing investigations, reconnaissance, or threat hunting, those sorts of things. And of course, like the content policy, it strictly states that they don't allow applications to generate any type of malware, but also hate, harassment, violence, self-harm, sexual, political, spam, deception. And they also state that any use cases that carry some greater risk of potential harm, like criminal justice, law enforcement, legal, government, civil services, healthcare, therapy, wellness, coaching, finance, and news. And in those cases, you want to be transparent with your users on the limitation and make sure that people who are on the team have domain expertise and understand and follow relevant laws. So there I'm thinking like, you know, if you're writing like, say, an affidavit or like some legal contract that may have life-altering, you know, ramifications, yes, you can use this to generate something as a basis, but you probably want to have actual experts review it before you kind of publish it, right?
Yeah, I've seen examples where ChatGPT, by its very nature, it doesn't like couch its answer. So like a human might say, well, I think it's this, but remember, I'm not a lawyer. If you say ChatGPT, hey, write me a living will, I don't know if it does that or not, but let's just say theoretically it would and spit it out. It's not going to be like, I'm not a lawyer, so you may want to have an attorney review this first. It's just going to act like it knew it. John Ledger, the former CEO of T-Mobile, he's still really active social media presence. So he's like, I typed in, tell me about John Ledger into ChatGPT. And one of the things it stated, just plain as day, was he sits on the board of directors for WeWork. And he's like, I've never sat on the board of directors for WeWork. And it just stated it like a fact. So, you know, there's still some, of course, room for improvement. But the thing is, it says it like a fact. And we've all kind of had that friend who was really good at just stating things like they were 100% certain in them. And you kind of learn to take it with a grain of salt. You do have to do a little bit of that here right now, especially in, I think, those use cases you talked about, healthcare, therapy, wellness, coaching, finance, news, law enforcement, legal, government, and civil services, criminal justice. Those are really good examples of where, you know, I think the guidance they gave was really sound. And I mean, it's something that we're going to continue to wrestle with and work with as we have these technologies come online. There's going to be all sorts of ramifications from them. I've heard already of teachers wanting like a tool to determine if homework was written by AI. And I've seen people suggest like, well, maybe we need to change the way we teach instead of just trying to catch AI written text. Although I think I saw OpenAI has released a tool now to detect AI generated text. So maybe that's a thing. Who knows? But there's just so many ramifications, ethical, amongst others, that we're all going to have to deal with in a new world. And we've done with that before with other technological changes along the way, and we've mostly adapted to them. You think of the pervasiveness of the cell phone as an example. For the most part, people have learned when it is and isn't appropriate to use them. Of course, there are exceptions. We've pervasiveness of cameras on cell phones. We've learned there are places where it is and is not appropriate to use them. Again, there's cases to the contrary. I think this is going to be like that. And so the fact that there are societal challenges and changes we have to go through to adapt should be expected and is not an indictment on the usefulness of this technology. And I think some of these infosec use cases, because Andy, they would have helped me too, because I can't write Python and I sure as heck can't write PowerShell. That's really interesting. And even if it's not like perfect, just getting me pointed in the right direction, having a script that's got most of the pieces in place, that's valuable. And you didn't really mention this, Andy, as you were kind of talking the listeners through it, but these screenshot examples you have pasted in our show notes, they not only give you the script, they explain it. So ChatGPT actually says, this script uses the get-win event commandlet, blah, blah, blah. And it explains the whole PowerShell script. So you not only get the code, you get an explainer on what it is, what it does, and how it works, which is super helpful. So really, really cool stuff here, but of course, thought-provoking too.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you talk about academia, which is a little bit outside of the scope of our conversation, but I was listening to the Andrew Yang podcast, and he had someone on talking about ChatGPT. So of course I had to listen to it. And he said that academia actually responded very quickly to ChatGPT, and, you know, almost overnight, take-home exams are pretty much non-existent anymore for like the humanities, right? If you had to like write an essay or something like that, it's in person. And he said that some professors went as far as like going back to oral exams immediately, which like haven't been done since like the early 1900s in universities. And so there may be a return of that sort of stuff where you just have to know your stuff and perform it in person, rather than, you know, take it home and do technology. Or maybe we'll find a different way. Maybe this stuff, you know, I was thinking about it today, is like, as people have more technology, their brains just adapt differently. And I was thinking about all the things that like I used to do growing up, like looking stuff up in an encyclopedia or finding a book using the library, you know, system that you had to actually learn how to do. And now no one knows that. No one really uses it anymore in real life. No one even goes to a library anymore for the most part. So people just adapt in society. And, you know, I think this is going to be one of those things that future generations are going to adapt to and just kind of use, right? Like, one of the things that's just kind of funny is penmanship has gone down over the years because people don't write as much anymore. Everyone types. And so like they don't teach cursive really anymore because nobody writes it anymore, right? So it's just kind of interesting. I think this is just one of those things that society will maybe adapt to in the future, but it is definitely a big change.
Absolutely.
And so I talked about the API that is available. When I asked OpenAPI, this was actually kind of interesting. I asked OpenAPI how to get I asked OpenAI, the ChatGPT, how to get the API, and it told me that it was not available for public use. But there was a Medium blog that I found that said that you can actually create an account with OpenAI and then go and get an API key. And I tested that, and I was able to get an API key. So you can get an API key, and there's a lot of things that you can do with it. The Medium blog that I saw was using it for Microsoft Sentinel. So, of course, me being familiar with Microsoft Sentinel and interesting how ChatGPT could be integrated with that, I read through the blog, and this person created a Sentinel playbook that uses the OpenAI connector. And then in the playbook is an Azure Logic app that will query ChatGPT based on a prompt that you provide. And you have to be pretty descriptive with the prompt. And if you're familiar with Azure Logic apps, you can put in different fields. There's fields that you can fill in. So say, for example, the incident title or the incident description or entities within the incident, like IP addresses or something like that. So you can have those fields, but then the rest of it's kind of the natural query language of how you would ask something in ChatGPT. So like this person said, help me with incident management for incident title, quote, where the incident description is, quote, incident description, and then the incident entities are, quote, entities. And so you're filling in those quotes with the actual field for the Logic app, which should fill in automatically. And then the response for ChatGPT will then automatically get added into the Sentinel incident comments section. And they tested it. And so the test example alert was sign-ins from IPs that attempted sign-ins to disabled accounts. And so that alert is identifying IP addresses with failed attempts to sign into one or more disabled accounts, but then signed into successfully to another account, which of course can be malicious, right? Maybe it's a password spray, right? It's just spraying across a bunch of accounts. It senses a bunch of disabled ones, and then it finds one that's successful. But also could be legitimate as well, like maybe from your company IP address, right? Like it's detecting that because someone has some disabled account that's pinging and some sort of automation, and then there's a bunch of successful sign-ins too. So either way, the response from ChatGPT was super interesting because it took both of them into account. It said, to resolve the incident, you must first identify the disabled accounts by reviewing Azure Active Directory sign-in report and cross-referencing with the IP addresses provided. Once you identify the disabled accounts, you can then take any necessary steps to re-enable them. So that's like, maybe you have an account that was disabled accidentally and someone was trying to sign into it legitimately, so go and re-enable it. But then additionally, it said you can also review the IP address provided to see if any of those other accounts have been successfully signed in, then take necessary steps to secure those accounts. So that's if it's the other side and it's malicious and you had a bunch of disabled ones and then successful ones that weren't expected, right? And so, it doesn't go into a bunch of steps of like how to do that, but of course, again, it gets you in the right direction if you had no idea what to do with it, and it puts that in the comments. So I thought that was another really good use. I think the uses are going to be unlimited just based on what you can think of. But another reason why infosec professionals should be kind of up on this is because it's used for coding. It can even review code for you. I've seen in instances where people have cut and pasted code in there, and then ChatGPT will then output the errors in the code. And because of that, companies like Google and Amazon have already implemented policies to prevent their employees from copying in proprietary code. because I haven't researched it, but I have no idea, like when you do a query, where that data goes, but I'm sure you're just feeding into the AI model, right? And if you're feeding in proprietary code, that probably isn't the best thing to do. So, if you have proprietary code at your company, this might be something you want to kind of keep an eye on for your software engineers and maybe limit or at least warn them, put in an administrative policy at the very least to say, hey, don't copy in proprietary code that you're working on for a company.
I think Microsoft has a policy like that too. Now.
I'm sure we do. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So, I mean, a lot of different uses. Not, this is not like a security focused tool, but there's definitely use cases that if I was in a security shop at a company today, I would use it for generating code that would be beneficial to menial tasks that a lot of us have to do as infosec professionals.
Well, just having that awareness, right? If you're in this business, you have to have that ferocious curiosity to always learn more, to always understand next. Our job is never done. I talked to a customer today that had been hit with Evil Jinx, which we covered on the show almost 2 years ago now, that the machine in the middle attack or adversary in the middle attack, where you're proxying a connection, you're stealing session tokens in the middle of it. And I had to walk the customer through, first off, this is not specific to Microsoft. Second, there are ways to solve this, and then there are mitigations. And here are the ways to solve it. And they're like, we don't want those. We don't like those options. Okay, then you can mitigate it. But they weren't curious. This had been around for a while. They were kind of surprised by it, and they didn't have that sense of curiosity about it. And I just thought that was an interesting, dynamic. And these weren't infosec professionals, to be clear, that I was talking to, but it just reminded me of like having awareness into what could happen, and understanding that is helpful for when we do need to respond to that and we're not caught flat-footed by it. And is ChatGPT a threat today? No, not really. Is it something you can use to help you? Yeah, a little bit today. But what could happen in the future? And if you bring that curious mindset to it and you think of the art of the possible, it's a big frontier out there right now. We're on the precipice of one of those paradigm shifts in technology that don't come along very often. I think the last one, in my mind, as a technologist, was the birth of the iPhone and how dramatically that changed technology, where we all have a computer in our pocket now, and that's become people's primary personal computer, their most personal computer. And that was a fundamental shift. And then we've been kind of refining that model now for really the last 15 years. And this feels like the first big paradigm shift in the last 15 years, from my perspective. And dovetailing off of the whole kind of app store, growth that we had coming out of mobile devices and ubiquitous computing and powerful cellular connections anytime, anywhere. I mean, it's so crazy to think about the original iPhone shipped with 2G data, edge data on AT&T. I mean, it was measured in 2-digit or 3-digit kilobits per second, and today we have 5G connections that can be hundreds of megabits per second. I can pull 300, 400, 500 megabit per second connection on my T-Mobile iPhone now. And you just compare that order of magnitude shift, and this feels like the next big thing. It's fun as technologists to get to experience another one of those, because I think all of us remember that as technologists, that dopamine hit of how exciting it was, the gold rush of like 2007 and onward, and how exciting that was, seeing how fast things evolved, and the quantum leaps forward, and the new Android phone came out and it was just mind blowing. And then the iPhone came out and it did something really cool with a retina display or whatever. And this is the new thing, and it's super fun. I mean, seeing all these new products come out, this rumored possible launch of Bing infused with ChatGPT. I mean, Google's been pretty much an undisputed monopoly in search for 20 years. And that might be upended. Like, isn't that exciting? That excites me. I love it when the status quo changes, when things change. That's why we got into technology, because technology changes fast and it's always evolving and it's not static and set in place and set in stone. So to me, this is fun to talk about. It's fun to think about where it could go. And I hope our listeners are similarly energized and excited by what's to come, because this really is, and I don't mean to get over animated about it, but to me, it feels like that next big frontier in computing.
I knew you were going to use the iPhone as an example too.
I always do. I'm very guilty of that. But to me, I remember, and again, just kind of dating how much things have changed. At the time, Apple keynotes weren't live streamed. So you had to read like a live blog to follow it. And I read the live blogs and everything, but then I watched the video because it was posted hours later. And to me, it was like the first time I heard the Beatles. I mean, it was the simplest activities on that interface were so mind-boggling, just scrolling through a list of like contacts. If you go back and watch that video, people lose their minds for scrolling on it. But it was, we'd never seen anything like that before. And even to this day, by the way, I'm totally getting off topic, but like this is something Android still does not get right. To this day, scrolling on Android is like fundamentally wrong because it doesn't have that physics-based model that the iPhone does. Like it doesn't like gradually slow and stop. It feels jerky. And it doesn't have that rubber banding at the end of the list in the same way iOS does. Like iOS to this day still has, I know this sounds so stupid, the best scrolling experience though. And they nailed it 15 years ago and the crowd went nuts for it over freaking scrolling. But we all knew, we saw in that moment, like, this is a big deal. This is something new and exciting. And I kind of feel that way again.
Yeah. Very well said. Hopefully our listeners will go and try this out. If you get a chance. I do think there's a lot of great uses for it. And try it out while it's free, because right now it is. So that's our show for this week. Thanks for listening and watching as always. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or future topics you want to talk about. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.